Hey everyone, I am here with Ksenia Chmutina, and she is a senior lecturer at Loughborough University in the UK. You specialize in disaster capitalism and have studied a lot about disaster risk, and so you're a great person to talk about the Build Back Better plan from Joe Biden. So you wrote a piece about this in Current Affairs, Build Back Better for Whom? How Neoliberalism Recreates Disaster Risks, and you wrote this along with Wesley Cheek. I'd encourage everybody to check out this piece in Current Affairs. It's really well done. How are you doing, Ksenia?
I'm good. Hi, Emma. Thanks a lot for having me tonight.
Oh, of course. I really wanted to touch on this because I did not know that there was a significant history to the phrase "Build Back Better." In fact, I thought it was fairly clunky when Biden rolled it out. Can you talk about how that's been used throughout history, including recently by politicians like Justin Trudeau and Boris Johnson in the UK?
Right. So, yeah, I guess building back better is kind of a new phrase for those who are not in disasters or international development. But, we've been sort of tackling with this motto for a while now. So it was originally introduced, or not really introduced, but kind of popularized, I suppose, by Bill Clinton after the Boxing Day tsunami. Because he was then kind of leading the reconstruction efforts after the tsunami, and he pronounced this building back better as kind of the best way, to rebuild and to tackle all the inequalities and vulnerabilities and everything that kind of comes with it. And so then the United Nations Body for Disaster Risk Reduction, as it's called now, they sort of, I guess, using this popular face of Bill Clinton, right, took the motto and ran with it. And so now Building Back Better is actually one of the priorities in the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is the main international framework, that we kind of work under as disaster scholars and disaster practitioners. And then, for us, for disaster scholars, it has always been a problematic phrase. And so this year, it became kind of a bit of a shock where, first of all the politicians started using the word resilience, kind of here, there, everywhere. And then, of course, over the summer, everybody started using Building Back Better. And so Johnson, the UK Prime Minister, he came on TV in June, in the end of June, and kind of promised to completely rebuild the country. And he took it literally. So he's promised us to kind of build, build, build. And his key phrase was about building back better, building back greener, and building back faster, because he was trying to boost the infrastructure. And then later in the summer, Justin Trudeau kind of used it as a centerpiece for his talk about COVID and the way that the Canada would go back to normal. And then, of course, Biden used it as his campaign, right? And we were all we did not expect that, I must admit. It was an interesting choice.
Yeah, well, it has a lot of history. So you said the word resilience. You wrote this in your piece. It's a great quote that I actually wrote in my notes. Build Back Better epitomizes the problematic ideology of resilience. And it focuses, you say in your piece, along with Wesley, that it focuses on disasters or frames them as inevitable, when in fact, we saw very starkly in Trump's response to COVID that a lot of the effects of disasters are choices. Can you talk about that?
Sure. Well, it's not just the effects of the disasters. Disasters are choices as well, right?
Yes,
So
yes.
there is this common phrase of sort of natural disasters that we have a lot of conversations about, in that when we call disaster natural, we inevitably move the responsibility onto nature, right? And therefore we're kind of saying, nature wins, I have nothing to do with it. Whereas we know that disaster isn't just about the natural hazard, it's a combination of a natural hazard and what we would call as condition of vulnerability, basically the root causes of social and societal systems that have been put in place sometimes centuries ago. So if we think about, for instance, the impacts of Maria, right, on the Caribbean, much of it is due to the colonial legacy and then kind of the imperial legacy. So disasters are really long-winded sort of processes that they just unfold, when vulnerability coincides with a hazard. And so when we talk about disasters, is that kind of we really need to think why we need to take naturalness out of it. And with resilience, it's sort of almost impossible, because resilience sort of frames disasters as inevitable, right? And resilience tells us that it's us who needs to be resilient, and we cannot actually address the root causes, right? So we must adapt instead of changing the situation that we are in and the system that we are in.
Yeah, that came through very clearly in your piece, just about how Biden's approach is just really neoliberalism personified, in the sense that right now it does
Right.
provide stability. And yes, the technocrats are seemingly excellent reprieves when compared to the chaos, as you write, of the Trump administration, but that they are only reinforcing the very systems that created a lot of this in the first place. I just want to go back a little bit, because you touch on how a lot of this originated post World War II. In international development, which push forward globalization, urbanization. You cite Japan, and the rebuilding of Germany, which is often in American history textbooks seen as this glorious project. And you know, in some ways, I can understand why it's framed that way, but there were a lot of unintended consequences of this, and you know, putting the United Nations, their creation of the World Bank, the IMF, putting them front and center, and then kind of planting the seed which sprouted within a few decades later under Thatcher and Reagan of modern day neoliberalism. Can you give us a historical sense? I know I covered a lot there.
Yeah, it's great. So I just need to add a little bit. Well, it's all that you said, but basically, what happened is that when the institutions like the World Bank, for example, or the IMF were established, the primary role of the World Bank was to focus on international development. And in fact, it was an institute for the international development. But of course, that development needed to be delivered in a way that developed countries, and very much US system in particular, have decided that systems, you know, places need to be developed, sorry. And that development was very much grounded, or and still is very much grounded in the ideas of growth, which is economic growth, right? And it kind of coupled with GDP. And so what has been happening in global South, so the post-colonization and kind of fight for independence, wasn't considered. And I'm assuming it was kind of a decision that was consciously made, right? Wasn't considered because that didn't fit in the narrative of development as it was proposed by this new established institutions. And so kind of over the decades that the World Bank is delivering international development, right, and helps everybody develop, this globalized effort, this kind of international effort, it helped to propagate this then new ideology of neoliberalism, right, and just embed it in such a way that it now probably became the most resilient system. And as you know, somebody said that neoliberalism it's like a cat, it has 7 lives, and we're not seem to be able to.
Yeah. Well, I actually wanted to just flesh that out for a little bit, because neoliberalism is, you know, it can take on many forms, but I think the primary core of it is that it's deregulating and allowing markets to do what they do, and removing government from the marketplace. But, you know, you can see a lot of what was done post World War II as like a very state-sponsored project, in the sense that the United States and the Allies tried to set things up using their own governmental systems. But how did that get thwarted? How did that get distorted into becoming the neoliberal systems that we're seeing today, that Biden clearly is like a part of? Because setting up those markets, it just seems like it kind of got it got distorted in a way.
Yeah, so I guess we kind of need to see neoliberalism not just a sort of managerial project, right, or you know, technocratic managerial project, but it's more a kind of project of perhaps, you know, precarity and profit, because we know that what we want really, and you know, going back to build back better, and the ideas of disaster risk reduction, the pure ideas of disaster risk reduction and development, is redistribution and equality. But of course, this don't coincide, right? You cannot have equality and profit at the same time. And so neoliberalism, being so malleable and kind of so multifaceted, it's just so easy to use, right? And kind of easy.
That's kind of what I was getting at. Yeah,
right. And
yeah.
you can kind of mold it in a way that you want, right? And really, what it builds upon is your individual ability to do something, the kind of the praise, right, for like, I don't know, American dream, or like being entrepreneurial or something like that.
Bootstraps.
And of course now it's been, kind of, it's been used and used and used. And we see it everywhere in disaster context quite significantly.
So another quote from your piece is, the emphasis of Build Back Better is on continuity, i.e. to keep going no matter what. I definitely think Biden even boldly marketed himself as a return to normalcy. A lot of the frustration from progressives like myself is that, well, normalcy is exactly what created Donald Trump in the first place, and there's not very much normal about the conditions that existed before. So can you talk about Build Back Better as continuity in the context of Biden, and also how it was used by these other world leaders and in these other historical contexts that you're referencing?
So I think the kind of the continuity and normality it's exactly what you said, right? And Biden, I mean, he has a fantastic platform to do that, right? Because I suppose what was pre-Trump is considered normal, whereas again we know that inequality existed, right? Injustice existed, but all of that was just so kind of nicely presented that Biden just builds on that without actually trying to solve the problems, the root causes of the problems. And they're sort of going back to normal, you know, in COVID, it's really a phrase that sort of triggers me because normal, I guess, we almost equate it as good, right? But again, good for who? And who decides what is good? But we kind of live in this binary world, right, of choice where we have to pretend that things are good, right? We almost forced to kind of literally live in a way that one is better than the other, right? Because this is how society wants us. And in some ways, this sort of normal or good categorizes as if you don't want to return back to normal, or if you're not pushing for normal, it means you're pushing for something kind of unintelligible or perhaps even incomprehensible, right? So normal seen as a desired or desirable state, and in a way that everything that is abnormal is seen as kind of wrong and bad, and of course we don't want to be bad.
Yes, I mean, that's exactly how Biden framed his campaign. And it's interesting, though, that you talked about Boris Johnson at the start. Obviously, I mean, he's kind of lazily been referred to as the UK's Trump. But he's not that. I mean, he puts on this blundering facade when he's actually a lot more Machiavellian than Trump, who's I think a lot dumber than Boris Johnson. Not to get too much off on a tangent here, but Boris Johnson represents the right wing of the UK, and yet he is echoing similar language to Joe Biden when talking about infrastructure and a greener infrastructure. I mean, that is shocking in how, at least in language, I mean, also the UK's right-wing party doesn't even, the Tories don't even touch the healthcare system in the UK too. So just, you know, to me, that's a little snapshot of how deeply embedded neoliberalism is in both parties in the United States, and really in both parties in places like the UK too, although the US is even further right in that kind of amorphous or malleable political spectrum when you look at it internationally. Right. Just wanted to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're so to the right now because the center, and so to the right that the center kind of seems left all of a sudden, you know. And you're totally right in that, you know, Johnson is very good in kind of talking the talk, and he's an absolute manifestation of kind of Thatcherism, right? When she was talking that there isn't such thing as society, he absolutely promotes that. You know, it's all about individual responsibility, and you know, I'm kind of going on and on with the same sort of thing. But basically, what he's saying is that no matter what austerity measures I put, if you're a good individual, right, you'll survive and you'll kind of suck it up, right, and you'll keep going. And yet, I think you're right in saying that he isn't stupid. These guys who are running the UK, they're extremely well educated, right? They have like the most privileged education. So they read Lenin and Gramsci and Trotsky, and everything else that left is reading and talking about. So they understand the left, and therefore are able to kind of undermine, I guess, with their rhetoric and their narrative much better than perhaps left is able to understand the extreme right that we have now. But what he is doing with COVID, and I'm sure you're aware that the response to COVID in the UK has been absolutely atrocious. We're number one now, leading the world finally in something,
yes.
In death per capita, which is shocking.
But it's not given the leadership. I mean, given exactly what we're seeing. Yes, yeah,
that's
and so yes. While in rhetoric he might be matching Biden, I do think there is a difference. I'm not somebody who likes to promote that false dichotomy, but I don't also want people to be illusioned into thinking, even if Biden is responding as an adult to these crises, that's not necessarily the broader goal. And you write about how a much harder project is restructuring our systems, and this just reinforces systems. And how Build Back Better really represents the opposite of political change. It's technocratic stability. And I wrote that in my notes. I'm not sure if it's an exact quote from your piece or if it's just something I wrote, so I didn't want to misrepresent it. But yeah, I can't tell. My handwriting is terrible. But yeah, I guess I'll just we can wrap up with that. Even though I think it's a very good temporary stopgap for what was created by Trump, or what was disintegrated by him. How do you see a way to move forward in a much harder structural project when you have somebody who is so status quo, technocratic? I mean, Build Back Better, as you say, this phrase has been recycled for many years now, by these exact actors. How do you begin undergoing that?
$1 trillion question, I think. I wish I knew.
I saved the hardest one for last.
But I think, the first step is to accept that Build Back Better needs to be a political process, because at the moment it is treated as apolitical, right? It's just a continuation of kind of, as we said, going back to normal. Until it is treated or as a non-political matter, right, in a reality that relies on kind of market mechanisms, and in a reality that relies on reestablishing the status quo, Biden or any other administration just simply would not be able to even comprehend the structural issues that underpin the process. Because I don't think the structural issues are kind of new or invisible, but the rhetoric makes them invisible. And so until we, I guess, accept that, right, and until we denaturalize disasters, including COVID, we will simply be just kind of doing the same thing over and over and over again, because we don't want to take any responsibility for our actions.
I lied. This is the last question, because I've dabbled in Naomi Klein. Obviously, I'm sure you are deeply, deeply, intimately familiar with her work based on what you've been talking about. But I mean, she talks all the time about how it's industry, it's defense manufacturers, it's big oil, it's these nefarious massive corporations and corporate actors who are the ones who take advantage of disaster and who then push their own agenda forward. And right now, I mean, like, of course we need a vaccine immediately, but it's also in some ways reinforcing the for-profit healthcare system unintentionally. I mean, I joked about this. If I were president, obviously I would nationalize this effort. But that's not what we're seeing. So I think that's kind of what you're talking about. How do you reframe, truly final question, how do you reframe these issues and these disasters in a way that doesn't just cause people to crawl back into their hole and crave stability, but recognize that next time there's going to be another cataclysmic event and we're going to need structural change?
I think the only way to reframe this is in solidarity and mobilization. We can talk about this and we can write about it, but unless we actually hold government responsible through solidarity, right, through kind of peaceful action, it will be impossible. We've seen so many examples of this, right? And I think there is now gradually, we can see the movement towards mutual care and mutual support, because COVID really exposed everything that has been wrong with the society, like in such a deep way that we've probably never seen before, particularly for us, for people living in a safe, I'm kind of thinking, environment.
Right.
And so, yeah, until we kind of mobilize in solidarity, that there is no hope for us.
Oh, well, on that note, no, I mean, there is hope. I do think I am seeing that glimmer as well. But
yeah.
Ksenia Chmutina, she is a senior lecturer at Loughborough University in the UK and wrote this piece, Build Back Better for Whom, How Neoliberalism Recreates Disaster Risks in Current Affairs, alongside Wesley Cheek. Thank you so much, Ksenia, for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you so much, Emma.